Welcome to Scripture and Shadows, Christianity's hidden canon. We're the place for deep dives into those foundational, sometimes forgotten, and maybe even occasionally forbidden texts of Christianity.
Texts that have really shaped things over the centuries.
Exactly. And today, for our 21st exploration, we're heading east, looking at a collection called Hymns of the Eastern Church, Forgotten Songs of Divine Fire.
Right. These are translations by J.M. Neale from way back in 1884.
And it's kind of amazing, isn't it, how much of this really rich Eastern Orthodox tradition is still, well, not widely known in the West.
It really is. Neale himself comments on it. He was quite surprised, actually, finding so few English translations compared to, say, Latin hymns.
He mentions something quite staggering, doesn't he?
Yeah, he talks about 18 quarto volumes of Greek church poetry. I mean, just imagine that. A huge body of work, mostly inaccessible to English speakers then, and honestly still largely is.
18 quarto volumes. Wow. That really puts the scale into perspective. And these aren't hymns like maybe the four-line verses we often think of.
No, not generally. The Eastern Church's hymnography, it developed its own quite unique forms.
Okay, so what are we talking about structurally?
Well, the dominant style isn't really traditional verse with, strict meter and rhyme. It's better described as measured prose.
Measured prose. So rhythmic, but not strictly metrical.
Exactly. Highly rhythmic, very structured prose. The key building block is something called the hyrmos.
The hyrmos.
Right. Think of it as the model stanza. It sets the melody, the rhythm, the whole pattern.
Okay, the template.
Precisely. And then you have the triperia. These are the stanzas that follow the hyrmos. They stick to its pattern, often developing the same themes.
So hyrmos leads, triperia follow.
Got it. And then you also mentioned the ode and the canon.
Yes. A series of triperia kicked off by their hyrmos. That makes up an ode.
Right.
And the canon is seen as the sort of peak achievement, the most developed form of this Greek ecclesiastical poetry. A full canon usually has 9 odes.
9 odes.
Although, interestingly, the second ode is almost always left out in practice. Oh, why leave out the second one?
It comes down to their models. These odes are based on 9 specific scriptural canticles, the ones traditionally sung at the morning service, lauds.
Okay.
And the second of those scriptural canticles, well, it's usually only recited during Lent. So its corresponding ode in the canon generally gets omitted outside of that season.
Okay, that makes liturgical sense.
And what's really fascinating is how these hymns connect the themes of each ode back to its scriptural canticle. Sometimes the links are, well, quite ingenious, maybe even a bit unexpected.
A creative interpretation, perhaps?
Definitely. And you also find things like acrostics, where initial letters spell things out, and Theotokia.
Theotokia.
Those are stanzas specifically honoring the Virgin Mary, often tacked onto the end of each ode.
So a really intricate, multi-layered form of expression, both poetic and theological.
Very much so.
Now, Neale gets into why the Eastern Church went down this road, this measured prose path, instead of sticking with classical Greek forms or fully embracing rhyme like the Latin rest did. What were the reasons?
Well, a big part of it was just the natural evolution of the Greek language. Classical Greek wasn't the everyday spoken language anymore.
Right.
And new Christian ideas, new vocabulary, they just didn't sit comfortably in those old classical meters. Dean Trench had a great line about Latin poetry, saying, "New wine must be put into new bottles." It applies here, too.
The old forms couldn't quite hold the new content.
Pretty much. Neale even notes how rare hexameters are in the New Testament itself. It was an early sign of that shift. The new faith needed new ways to be sung.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about rhyme? Latin hymns are full of it. Why didn't the East go that route?
That's interesting. Neale points out there were hints of rhyme, even back in Homer. But as Greek evolved, the key thing became accent. The stress on syllables rather than quantity, the length of syllables like in classical meter.
Okay, accent became more important than length.
Right. And while accentual rhyme did develop in later Greek, it seems the church viewed it as a bit. Well, maybe too common. Too much like everyday speech.
A bit vulgar, as Neale puts it.
Yeah, perhaps lacking the sort of elevated sacred tone they wanted for worship. They preferred drawing on older, maybe more established liturgical prose forms instead of fully adopting what felt like a more popular, less refined style.
So a deliberate choice for a certain kind of linguistic dignity, maybe, keeping a connection to older traditions.
It seems that way. And this preference really fueled the development of that measured prose style we were talking about.
Where did they find the models for that?
Well, they found precedents right in the New Testament, references to hymns and spiritual songs. And you see that rhythmic quality in very early church prayers and declarations, like the Glorias in Excelsis, or the Eastern equivalent of the Te Deum. This rhythmic prose became the bedrock.
Let's dig into that structure again. The hiermos and troparion system. You said the hiermos is the model. How does that actually play out when sung?
Okay, so the hiermos gives you the tune and the rhythm for a whole set of troparia. It's a complete stanza, musically and poetically.
The blueprint.
Exactly. Then the troparia follow, matching its structure, often exploring the same idea or image from different angles. Neale uses examples from the Psalms, like in 119 and 102, to show this kind of model and variation thing.
Okay.
But what's really unique, and maybe a bit strange to us, is how the troparia are divided up for chanting. It's often done by commas in the text, but these divisions can completely ignore the grammar or sense of the line.
Wait, the breaks for chanting might interrupt a phrase mid-thought.
Yes, exactly. It can look quite fragmented on the page if you don't have the music. The musical phrasing takes priority over the grammatical phrasing, you could say.
That's very different from how Western hymns usually work, where the music typically follows the sentence structure. Do you have an example?
Neale gives a great one. It's a hieramos from Odyssey, fourth tone. In Greek it goes, Aistostas taropriou polagos, paraskos exenes, ortlis destins, ertos esreratlis, pontelizods, paistos akrasas, to emelotimin, altos genok. Now, his English translation, trying to show those chanting breaks, reads like this. Israel in ancient times passing on foot with unbedewed steps the red gulf of the sea, turned to flight by the cross-typifying arms of noses the might of Amalek in the wilderness.
Ah, I see. Passing on foot with, comma, unbedewed steps, the red gulf, comma. Yeah, that really breaks the flow if you're just reading it.
It absolutely highlights that these texts were meant to be sung, heard within their musical context.
Yeah.
Reading them silently only gives you part of the picture.
And the canon, you said, is the pinnacle of all this.
Yes, the canon, with its 9 odes, or usually 8 in practice, is the most complex and developed form.
And each ode ties back to a scriptural canticle.
Right. And the hymn writers often get incredibly creative finding these typological links, seeing Christ or Christian themes prefigured in Old Testament events described in the canticles.
Those sometimes imaginative links you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Some might seem like a real stretch today, but it shows this deep, constant engagement with Scripture, trying to weave it all together into a coherent Christian narrative.
It definitely sounds like a tradition worth exploring more deeply. Neale, in his work, talks about key figures, dividing them into periods. The first is before the iconoclasm controversy. Who stands out from that early time?
The main figure Neale highlights is Anatolius. He died back in 458 AD.
Anatolius.
Neale sees him as really pivotal, the first poet to properly break away from those classical constraints and really pioneer this harmonious prose style. He draws a parallel with Venantius Fortunatus in the Latin West.
So an innovator.
Yes. His early stuff might not have been groundbreaking, but he developed the style. He's known for these lively Scishura short hymn verses. One is, "Fierce was the wild billow."
Oh, I think I know that one. Sometimes translated as peace, it is I.
That's the one. And also the very popular evening hymn, "The day is past and over." He wrote Stishura for feast days too, like St. Stephen's Day and Christmas, a great and mighty wonder. Some of his hymns have definitely made their way into English hymn books.
It's amazing to think hymns we might still sing have roots stretching back that far to the 5th century Eastern Church. Now, the second period Neale discusses is heavily influenced by the iconoclast controversy. Can you give us a quick refresher on what that was about?
Sure. The iconoclast controversy was this long, intense period, roughly 726 to 842 AD. It was all about whether religious images, icons should be used in worship. There were emperors who banned them, persecutions. It was a major struggle.
A really defining conflict for the Eastern Church.
Absolutely. And it deeply impacted everything, including hymn writing. Many hymnographers of this era were right in the thick of it, defending the use of icons through their hymns.
So the hymns became part of the theological battleground.
Very much so. Neale lists several key figures from this time. S. Andrew of Crete, S. Germanus, the big one, S. John Damascene, S. Cosmas, S. Theophanes, Theodore the Studium, S. Methodius the Say, and S. Joseph of the Studium.
That's quite a lineup. Let's start with S. Andrew of Crete. What's his main legacy?
Andrew of Crete died around 732. He's most famous for his massive great canon. It's sometimes called the King of Canons.
The Great Canon.
It's sung during Mid-Lent, and it's this incredibly deep penitential meditation on sin and redemption. It draws on tons of Bible stories, Old and New Testament figures as examples.
That's intense.
It is. It's very long, over 300 stanzas, but individual parts are just stunning. He was a master at finding those typological connections. He also wrote other pieces for Holy Week and Lent, like Stichera for Maundy Thursday, O the Mystery, Passing Wonder about the Last Supper, and Troperia for Palm Sunday.
Okay, next is S. Germanus. What about him?
Germanus was Patriarch of Constantinople until 734, and he was a strong opponent of the iconoclasts. His poetry isn't as extensive as some others, but it's often noted for being quite direct, maybe simpler in style.
Any examples?
Neale mentions stanzas for a Sunday in the first tone, starting by fruit, the ancient foe's device. It powerfully connects Adam's fall through eating the fruit with Christ's redemption on the cross, the tree of life.
A clear theological point. Now, S. John Damascene, his name is probably the most familiar to many. Neale calls him a father of the church and its greatest poet. That's high praise.
It absolutely is.
Oh.
John Damascene, who died around 780, is hugely important in Orthodoxy. He's credited with organizing a lot of the Octokis, that's the cycle of hymns in 8 tones, and his 3 great canons are legendary: Easter, the Ascension, and S. Thomas's Sunday.
The Easter canon especially.
Yes, the golden canon for Easter. It starts, "'Tis the day of resurrection," just pure exultation. Neale actually includes large parts of it, describing how it was sung at midnight in Athens, this incredible outpouring of joy. The opening lines alone just capture that explosive power of the resurrection.
Sounds incredible.
And he wasn't just about joy. He also wrote the incredibly moving Stichera for the Last Kiss, part of the funeral office, and the Idiomala for All Saints, those eternal bowers, which paints this beautiful picture of heaven. His canon for S. Thomas's Sunday, or Renewal Sunday, is also a major work, very rich theologically.
So, profound theology, but also deep emotion. What about S. Cosmas? He was a contemporary, right?
Yes, S. Cosmas died around 760. He was actually the foster brother of John Damascene. They grew up together, studied together, and had this really close creative relationship. They often inspired each other, maybe even competed a bit.
A poetic partnership.
You could say that. Cosmas is generally seen as the second great poet of this era, right after Damascene. He wrote a famous canon for Christmas Day. Christ is born, tell forth his fame. Neale even hints some might prefer it to Damascene's own nativity canon.
Really? What's his style like?
Cosmas is known for being very learned, very skillful with typology, those symbolic connections, but also remarkably concise. He packs a lot of meaning into his lines. He also contributed a lot to the Octoecus and wrote canons for feasts like the Transfiguration.
Yeah.
His hymn, The Choirs of Ransomed Israel, is a good example of his style.
It's fascinating how these figures interacted. Okay, moving on. S. Theophanes, what should we know about him?
Theophanes lived from 759 to 818. He was incredibly prolific. Neale ranks him third in terms of sheer output.
A lot of hymns.
A huge amount. But Neale also notes that with Theophanes, you start to see maybe the beginnings of a more formulaic approach.
Formulaic? How so?
Well, sometimes it feels like hymns were being written almost to fill quotas, to complete the liturgical books for all the saints' days, rather than purely from, say, intense personal inspiration. Not always, of course, he tackled major themes too, but the vast volume sometimes leads to a bit of repetition.
Understandable, perhaps, given the liturgical demands.
Exactly. Neale does mention some specifics, like idiomela for a Lenten Friday, hither, and with one accord, and particularly the Stichera known as Adam's Complaint. He even speculates it might have influenced Milton's Paradise Lost.
Oh, that's an interesting potential link across centuries and traditions. Okay, Theodore of the Studium. Another key figure in the iconoclast fight, wasn't he?
Yes, Theodore died 826. He was right at the center of the defense of icons, suffered exile, persecution, the works. A really strong, unwavering figure.
How does that come through in his hymns?
Neale actually ranks his hymns quite highly, better than Theophanes, maybe almost as good as Cosmas. What's interesting is the contrast Neale points out. Theodore's public life was very disciplined, very rigorous, almost stern, but his hymns reveal this deep inner fervor, real penitence.
The inner life revealed through art.
Precisely. He wrote a powerful canon for the Sunday before Lent, focusing on the Last Judgment, and also a really vibrant celebratory canon for Orthodoxy Sunday that's the feast celebrating the final victory over iconoclasm called a song of gladness.
A victory hymn. Makes sense. We also have S. Methodiusai on the list.
Right, Methodiusai died around 836. He was actually the patriarch who presided over the final official restoration of icons, so a very important historical role.
And his hymns.
He didn't write a huge amount, mostly idiomela, but they're significant. Neale gives the example, "Are thy toils and woes increasing? which focuses beautifully on the strength and comfort found in the cross.
A simple but profound theme. And the last figure from the second epoch is S. Joseph of the Studium. Neale calls him the most voluminous writer of them all.
He was incredibly prolific, yes, lived after the main iconoclast struggle had ended.
But Neale also suggests his work might not always appeal to Western tastes. Why is that?
It seems to be partly the sheer volume again. Joseph wrote canons for seemingly every saint, including many lesser-known ones. This sometimes led to, well, repetition and a style that can feel quite ornate, maybe even a bit bombastic to ears used to more concise Western hymns.
So quantity and perhaps a different aesthetic sensibility.
Possibly. But Neale still values his work. He includes several cento sets like compilations of verses such as Let Our Choir New Anthems Raise and Wilt Thou Pardon, Lord, and Stars of the Morning. And he really praises S. Joseph's canon for Ascension Day. He thinks it might even be better than Damascene's canon for that particular feast.
High praise indeed, especially considering Damascene's reputation. It really feels like this exploration isn't just about hymns, but about history, theology, culture, all wrapped up together.
Absolutely. It's a window into the soul of the Eastern Church across centuries.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into these, well, often forgotten songs, what are the main things you think we should take away?
Well, first, just the incredible depth and richness of this tradition. It's vast, and so much of it remains largely unknown territory for many in the West.
A hidden treasure, in a way.
Definitely. Second, I think understanding the unique style of this measured prose, the Hermos and Troparian system, shows a really sophisticated, different approach to sacred poetry, deeply tied to music and liturgy.
It's not just words on a page.
Not at all. And finally, even if the style or some themes feel unfamiliar, these hymns offer really powerful, unique perspectives on Christian faith. They connect us directly to the worship and belief of Eastern Christians throughout history.
Neale hoped, didn't he, that more of this Eastern tradition would filter into English hymnody.
He did. And it's good to know that some hymns, like Anatolius's The Day is Past and Over,
Yeah.
have become familiar.
It really shows the enduring power of these ancient songs, how they can still speak to us across time and culture. Maybe this conversation will encourage you, our listener, to seek some of these out, to explore this tradition a bit further.
There's certainly a lot more to discover.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the hymns of the Eastern Church.
It's been fascinating.